Hello everyone, and welcome to Story Premise. This is Chapter 4 of our featured fantasy story, Radiance and Corruption. I hope you enjoy it. Previously, on Radiance and Corruption, Henford, Turael, Merls, and Kincaid traveled to the town of Khaldil to investigate a missing shipment for a businessman named Strafford. Through some investigation, the foursome discovered a great monster under the very noses of the people. After vanquishing the creature plaguing Khaldil, they set out to Khaldil, the capital of Havion. Their purpose in traveling to Khaldil was to inform the king of the troubles in Khaldil. If you'd like to hear the story of Khaldil, click the card on screen. Now let's continue with Radiance and Corruption. Chapter 4, Where the Four Lands Meet. The bustling sounds of a city began to rise in a slow crescendo as Henford led the company toward the towering capital walls. Behind him walked his companions. Merls was using his quarterstaff as a walking stick, focusing on the trail as he trod along. Kincaid was next, eyes up, taking in the scattered buildings nearby. His hand was on the pommel of his sheathed sword. At the end of the group was Turael, whose hood was down, and his arms were hidden deep in his cloak. The group passed through the gates of the city, along with farmers, merchants, and craftsmen, who were all on their way to work. Henford had often been among them at this time of day, delivering horses and gear to his father's customers. The busy road led the four travelers into a thriving marketplace. The hum of chatter vibrated throughout the air. The succulent smell of roast meat wafted in the air as vendors called out to customers. Wreaths of flowers adorned the buildings, and polished marble fountains spewed crystalline water. Henford refocused on the task at hand. He could not get distracted by the beautiful atmosphere. Him and his companions had a mission here. Okay, so we need to do two things before we can all go home. Henford was quite excited to return home and tell his family about his adventures. We know, yawned Merls. We need to give a letter to Strafford's company manager, and then talk to the king about Khaldil. And then what? Kincaid asked. I suppose we can maybe get hired on more permanently for Strafford, Henford suggested. Not me, Merls said. I've got other places to be. I would be fine continuing for Strafford, Kincaid said, but not with this gear that I have. Good point, said Merls. I'm going to do some shopping. But we need to deliver that letter as soon as we can, Henford insisted. Well, if it's so important, Merls said, you can just go now and we'll all meet up in this city square when we're done. Sounds fair to me, Kincaid said, already stepping away. Henford gave an exasperated sigh. Fine, meet back as soon as you're done. Henford delivered the letter rather quickly. Strafford's manager was not there, so Henford let the assistant take it. Henford returned back to the city center to wait for the others. He returned in time to see an armored guard yelling at Turael, who was holding a fishing pole. After a few minutes, Turael walked back to Henford, a look of malcontent on his face. What's the matter? Henford asked. No fishing in the city fountains, Turael grumbled. He said he'd fine me if I kept it up. Turael continued muttering, staring daggers at the city guard. Hours passed. Perhaps I should have given the others a time frame. Just as Henford thought this, Merls and Kincaid emerged from the crowd. Merls was holding a couple of cloth bundles. What took you guys? Henford said. Now don't be so impatient, Merls said. I got each of you a present. He handed a bundle to Turael first, then Henford. Henford let the bundle unravel in his hands. It was a series of hard, flat plates, fixed to a sturdy sort of leather. What is this? Henford asked. You like it? Merls said. I had a craftsman fix it up today. It's armor made from the Hydra we killed together. Wherever you end up going after this, it'll be a token to remember our exploits by. It'll also keep you safe. Henford brightened up. Thank you, Merls. This was a very kind gesture. Turael also muttered his thanks. All right, I know we're all brimming with excitement to go talk to the king, Merls stated. Let's be off. Khaldil had 3 walls within its limits. The company had already passed the main wall, which stood about 12 meters high. The general populace could cross this wall freely. The second surrounded the noble district, where the wealthy lived. A large gatehouse was the only entrance to this district. Past this district was the third and final wall of the city. Within this wall was the castle keep, where the king lived. Henford knew the city best, so he led his companions to the gatehouse of the second wall. On their approach, the city guards perked up.
"What business do you have here?"
one guard asked. "We would like to request an audience with the king," Henford said confidently.
"What is the nature of this business?"
Henford opened his mouth to respond when Merls stepped in front of him. Merls was holding a wicked-looking black claw. It was about half a meter long. He dropped the claw to the dirt, then stepped back. The two guards exchanged dumbfounded expressions. Henford now spoke. "We bring tidings of a great beast seen tormenting the people of Khaldil. We would like to speak with the king about this incident, the proof of which you see before your eyes."
"Very well," the guard said in surprise. "Let me talk to my superior officer."
He stumbled off into the gatehouse. A few minutes passed before the guard returned with his commanding officer. After asking a brief explanation from Henford and his companions, the sergeant asked them to wait. This was urgent enough that the king should be able to see them today. An hour passed before the sergeant returned.
"His Highness King Beldar will see you now. Remember that you will be standing before high authority. You are to speak only when addressed. Do not do anything to provoke his wrath, for he will be the one to determine your fate if you do so. Am I understood?"
The sergeant gave them all a very serious look. The foursome all nodded their heads in agreement to the sergeant's words. The sergeant scrutinized the four of them for a few seconds, then nodded. As he led the way through the gatehouse, a contingent of guards surrounded the group. Their eyes warily focused on Henford and his friends. Henford's heart began to flutter in anticipation. The gatehouse opened into a beautiful courtyard, where gardens flourished beside a few tall mansions. The keep was visible just beyond a final wall. They continued onward through, and made their way to the great wooden doors of the keep. Another pair of soldiers pushed the keep doors inward. Henford and his friends were escorted inside. They were immediately met by a grand staircase leading into a great hall. Pillars supported the high vaulted ceiling of this magnificent chamber. Torches burned in their sconces, casting shadows around the room. Royal red banners adorned the hall, depicting the nation's crest, a white horse with a golden mane surrounded by an olive wreath. A still silence hung in the air, broken only by the steps of those entering the great chamber. At the end of the chamber sat two gilded thrones, ornamented with gold. Upon the throne of one sat a regal figure, wearing a red satin robe over his shoulders. Underneath the robe was gleaming ornamental armor. His gray-streaked brown hair was to his shoulders. Atop his head was a golden crown. Storm-gray eyes looked upon the newcomers. His eyes had bags under them, hinting at a great fatigue. The sergeant stepped in front of the procession.
"Your Majesty, these individuals are those who requested to speak to you about an urgent matter."
"I will hear them," King Beldar said. The tight formation of the guards released around Henford, Merls, Kincaid, and Turael.
"Who stands before His Majesty, Ruthwin Beldar, King of Havion?"
said a slightly nasal voice to the right of the king. An elderly gentleman was standing there. Henford had not noticed him, as all his attention had been focused on the regal king in the room. The elderly man had long, thin, wispy gray hair. He was stooped over. Henford spoke first. "I am Henford Rolfe of Kent. My name is Kincaid. I am from Tantar." Turael of Woodsprig. Merls hesitated.
"I am Merls of, Khaldil."
Merls was from Khaldil? That can't be right, thought Henford.
"What brings you here before the court today?"
The elderly man continued, sneering at Henford and his companions. There were others in the room. Seated to the left of the throne sat a man with long blonde hair. He was wearing lavish robes and sported a few rings with jewels on them. Pacing the floor, to the side of the contingency of the knights, was a beefy knight with dark skin, and a helmet plume that signified him to be of high military rank. "We were hired by a man named Strafford to investigate a missing caravan of his," Henford began. "We found the wreckage near a small town called Khaldil. We entered the town hoping to investigate the cause of the destroyed shipment. Nobody knew anything about it. But there was something in the town." Henford looked to his companions. unsure of how to say it. "Go on. What was it?" urged the king, a suspicious look crossing his face. "A monster," Kincaid stepped forward to answer. "A large reptilian beast had been devouring the townsfolk, a serpent with many heads, whose song could make people forget its very existence." Dead silence hit the room. The king was too stunned to speak. The elderly man began fidgeting with his hands incessantly. A mildly amused look played its way across the blond man's face.
"What a ridiculous story,"
the elderly man blurted out.
"Your Majesty, I say we do away with this group. Spreading rumors, telling lies to even you."
"We have proof," said Merls. Merls unslung his pack. Knights on either side of Merls drew their swords quickly, suspicious of what Merls might do. Merls paid them no mind. He dumped his pack on the floor. Hydra scales, claws, horns, and bones scattered on the floor. A collective gasp sounded in the room. "King's General, bring me the evidence," the king said. The dark-skinned knight picked up a long claw and several scales and brought it up to the king. King Beldar turned the claw over in his hand several times, brow furrowed. "Your Majesty," Henford started, "what does your wizard make of this?" He nodded toward the blonde-haired man in the robes. The king grunted in confusion. He looked between the two men at his sides. "You mean Gallander here? A wizard?" he scoffed. "Gallander is here to fill the place of Duke Typhir, who is busy with preparations for an event of his."
"Your Highness," the elderly man said, "these people are clearly trying to manipulate you. All these words of magic and monsters, they echo some of the rumors attempting to defame you."
"Defame you?" Henford asked. "What is happening?"
"Either you are feigning ignorance or you genuinely are," the king mused. "Rumors of similar situations to yours have arisen. Some have been publicly debunked, while others remain to be seen. My court will have to think upon this. Someone will be sent to Clefdale to see the proof and speak with more witnesses. In the meantime, we will have to put you under lock and key."
"What?" said Henford incredulously. Merls, Kincaid, and Turael wore looks of surprise on their faces.
"These are serious allegations," King Beldar stated. "We need to validate these rumors, but we cannot allow anyone to spread false information around the kingdom. Should your story prove to be true, you will be released. If it is false," the king stood up and looked intensely into the eyes of the assembled, "you will remain in that prison for the rest of your lives." The king's tone relaxed slightly, but still held a layer of force to it. "King's General Tabert, see them to the upper levels of the prison. Treat them as guests. We know not if they are criminals." "I will see it done," General Tabert nodded.
Kincaid. The upper levels of the prison were not too bad. Kincaid had never lived in such comfort, despite the severe lack of freedom that was offered them as prisoners. The furnishings were incredible. The beds were soft and the rooms bright. There were even a few books in the room for passing the time. Every day there was an opportunity for the guards to escort the foursome on a walk through the city gardens. The spires of temples and sanctuaries could be seen in the orchards of the city. However, these strolls were always cut much shorter than Kincaid would have liked. About a week later, the day of judgment came. The general arrived, a grim expression on his face, a contingency of guards accompanying him. Kincaid wondered if he should be worried. Their story was true, so he had nothing to fear, right? Evidence would come to light, and the king would release them. They were brought into the great hall once more. The king paced agitatedly in front of his throne. Upon the arrival of the prisoners, King Beldar snapped out of his trance and fixed his eyes on the newcomers. A stillness filled the air as Beldar stared at Kincaid and his friends.
"Ardenald, give them the official verdict,"
King Beldar said with conviction. The elderly man pulled out a scroll and began to read it, his eyes twitching.
"Upon charges of treason, perjury, and deception of the highest degree, Henford of Kent, Kincaid of Tantar, Turael of Woodsprig, and Merls of Khaldil are all sentenced to a life of imprisonment."
Merls roared in rage. Turael attempted to sneak back, away from the chaos, but he was grabbed by a pair of guards. Henford stood, shocked. Ardenald continued reading.
May their crimes serve as a solemn reminder that King Beldar's authority is absolute, and all who spin deception before him will spend the rest of their days stewing upon their misdeeds.
Henford yelled desperately. What about our evidence? What about Clefdale? What did Strafford say? King's General Tabert, take them to the dungeons, King Beldar stated with finality. As manacles clasped on Kincaid's arms, he struggled, but the guards held fast to him, dragging him toward the stairs. The last view Kincaid had of the room was King Beldar, who settled down onto his throne, leaning back, his expression stern. The lower levels of the prison were much less comfortable than the upper cells. A moldy cot was the only convenience provided to Kincaid. His cell block was empty, except for his friends who were separated into their own cells. Merls shook the bars of his cell and probed them for weaknesses. Henford was busy trying to call the guards to talk to them. Turael was fiddling with a pebble in his cell. Merls could not break his cell door. Henford was having no luck getting a guard to speak with him. Kincaid began to think of all the events that had led him to this point in his life. He thought of how his mother urged him not to leave the farm, how he could help them there. The farm didn't seem so bad now, come to think of it. Kincaid thought of how badly he wanted to find his older brother, to see him again. Ivor had left the farm years before Kincaid had. Kincaid had hoped to find Ivor someday, to learn why he left. Kincaid would never be able to do this, as long as he was stuck in this prison. Do you think they'll ever let us out? Henford said. Do you know what a life sentence means? Kincaid said with contempt. I know, but if they find out we weren't lying... You don't understand, Kincaid said sharply. They already went to Clefdale. They talked to people there and couldn't get enough evidence. We're stuck here to rot. Kincaid knew he shouldn't take his frustration out on Henford, but hope was not something Kincaid needed right now. I don't think they even tried, Merls said. Strafford would have testified himself if he had the chance. But why would they just throw us in prison? Even if we did lie to the king, why such a harsh judgment? Henford asked. I reckon he don't like liars, Turael said shortly. Kincaid rolled onto the cot, facing the wall. He had had enough of this conversation. He punched his cot, whether out of frustration or in a vain attempt to soften the mattress, he didn't know. The other prisoners bickered about their situation, but Kincaid was too consumed by his own thoughts to care. After hours of frantic thinking, a restless sleep overtook Kincaid. They were so deep in the prison that no natural light could reach them, only torchlight. A diet of bread and limp, uncooked vegetables was the only sustenance they received, besides a bucket of water that came daily. This was the only way that Kincaid could mark the passage of time. The prison life was boring, and doing nothing grew to be exhausting. Days passed with no signs of being pardoned. Merls began talking of escape, but none of their ideas held any promise. Turael spent his time scratching and carving on the walls of his cell. Even Henford's words began to lose their optimism as their collective hopes withered. Then, one fateful night, Kincaid was blinking his bleary eyes when the torches in the hallway were all snuffed out by a breeze. It was a stark surprise, since they had never been in darkness in this cell block. The contrast made it hard for Kincaid to see his surroundings. Slow footsteps echoed in the silent hall. Kincaid heard scuffling and rustling sounds of his friends, who seemed to also be awake. Hello? Henford said with uncertainty. In response, a powerful voice resonated within the air. Henford, Turael, Merls, and Kincaid. 4 stalwart men, imprisoned by the very king they wish to help. These are regrettable times, times when traitors abound, and the just become vile. I know of your struggles, your sincerity, and your desperation. As such, I have come to offer you freedom. Was this a trick? Who was this? Kincaid squinted into the dark. He could see a tall, broad silhouette through the bars of his cell. The voice continued. But freedom comes at a small price. Of my own personal risk have I come to offer you this deal. I have a task to be done.
If you pledge your services to me, I will allow you to be free. I will even give you certain gifts. Refuse my offer, and you will stay in this prison for the rest of your days, in accordance with the king's edict. What do you say?
Was this really the way out of this prison? Kincaid wondered. But who was this, and what did they want? Despite his suspicion, Kincaid wanted to be out of here. He found himself saying the words, "I accept," and the others muttered their assent as well.
Very good.
The figure snapped his fingers, and Kincaid's eyes fluttered closed. The sound of lapping waves was the first thing that Kincaid heard. He could feel that his neck was sore, doubtlessly from nights of sleeping on a rock-hard cot. Beneath his head now was no cot nor pillow. It was wood. He felt himself smoothly rocking, as if he were in a cradle. He opened his eyes to see the sun, which was almost blindingly bright in the sky. Seagulls squawked overhead. As Kincaid looked down from the sky, he first saw the tip of a mast, which led to a white sail. He was on a small sailboat. "See that, Calhoun? Sleepyheads are finally waking up," said a Hoyden voice. Kincaid shielded his eyes from the sun. On the bow of the boat stood a young woman in a white blouse and brown leather pants. She was holding the arm of a sail, directing the boat across the waves. Kincaid scrambled to his feet. "Who are you? Where are you taking us?" The boat rocked and he stumbled, falling back to the deck floor. "Ha ha ha! I suggest you sit down for a while. It's going to be quite the voyage," the woman responded. Kincaid looked around to see his pack and weapons were beside him. Didn't the prison guards take these? Suddenly, Kincaid felt burning pain in his left hand. For some reason, he was wearing a single glove over that hand. He removed the glove, seeing a black burn mark on his palm. How did I get this? The pain intensified. Kincaid quickly replaced the glove on his hand. Kincaid then slowly grabbed his sword and soundlessly unsheathed it. There was no telling if this woman was friend or foe. "I'm not sure you want to do that, mate," the young woman said, just barely glancing at the tip of Kincaid's blade. "Would you really turn your blade on your rescuers? We could have let you stay in that dreadful prison, but we didn't." Kincaid sheathed his sword. "Rescuers?" "Yep," she replied, flipping her brunette hair. "We're the ones that carried your lazy rear ends to our boat." She put her hand to the side of her mouth and muttered to Kincaid, "The bodybuilder was the heaviest. Needs to lay off the extra grub." She pointed to Merls, who was wiping his bleary eyes. "My name is Sestra, and that handsome young gent there is my little brother, Calhoun." Sestra indicated toward the back of the boat, where a teenage boy sat, holding to the rudder. His facial features were not quite adult, but not entirely childlike either. The resemblance between him and Sestra was clear. They shared the same upturned nose, and the same round jawline. With the new attention on him, Calhoun smiled uncertainly. He gave a small wave. "I thought our rescuer was a large man, not a girl and her little brother," said Kincaid. Sestra rolled her eyes. "Are you always this thick-headed? Obviously, he is our boss, or sponsor, as he likes to be called." "Who is he really?" Kincaid asked. "Not sure," Sestra answered nonchalantly. "Seems like you know just as much as we do," Merls pointed out. Maybe," Sestra said with a sly smile. Turael. Turael didn't mind the company. Sure, it was a little strange to wake up on a boat with two strangers steering it, but it wasn't the weirdest thing Turael had been through. Speaking of which, this would make a great entry for his journal. Ever since his experiences in Clefdale, Turael wanted to document the events on this strange journey. Yesterday's antics proved to be quite the prompt. Eventually, Turael closed his journal and turned his attention to fishing. He had the perfect lure for saltwater varieties somewhere in his bag. The deviance in travel plans didn't bother Turael, as long as he would be able to return to Woodsprigg soon. He didn't make much coin in his journeys, but what he had should be able to help his widowed mother and younger brother a bit. Who knows, maybe the person in charge of this job would pay Turael a decent amount. Suddenly the line went taut. A bite. Turael reeled in eagerly. A fish flapped around on the surface of the water. Too small. Turael unhooked the fish from the line and threw it back in. Night came. Turael fished for a little while longer, but eventually decided to turn in. As he prepared for sleep, he noticed something odd. He started untying his boots, only to realize that they were not the pair he had previously. Someone had given him a different pair. Turael shrugged, took off his boots, then went to sleep. The next morning came. Calhoun was fast asleep, having steered the boat during the night. Prompted by the men's questions, Sestra admitted they would be returning to Havion after finding, quote, where the four lands meet. Supposedly, their sponsor wanted them to retrieve something special from that place. Throughout their sailing, Turael noticed something odd. During their travels, Henford had been very talkative. In contrast, he seemed fairly tense. At one point, Sestra asked him to hand her a canteen, and he stuttered, sure. Maybe Henford was still shook from being imprisoned. "Land ho!" Sestra called. On the eastern horizon was a blur that was starting to grow into a landmass. As the boat approached the island, the golden dunes of a desert came into view. They disembarked. Merls helped Calhoun drag the boat onto the beach. "All right, boys. Now our sponsor wanted us to find an artifact where the four lands meet. That's somewhere on this island. Let's fan out with each other in sight. Nobody wander away too far. We didn't break you out of prison for you to get lost." "You mean you don't know where we're going?" Merls asked. "Our sponsor was very vague, but that doesn't mean we won't be able to do the job. Now move out. We're going north first." Sestra turned on the spot and started walking northward. The men shared a confused look and began to follow. The noon sun made the trek arduous. Walking through sand took extra stamina, and water rations took a hit. After hours of trekking, the sand gave way to a dry, cracked red clay. Visible ahead were bluffs and buttes. Sestra began leading the group east. The clay was much easier to walk on, and the group was able to take less breaks. A cool breeze swept the sweat from Turael's brow, as afternoon began to yield to evening. Still, they hiked onward. "That's it for our water rations," Kincaid said. "Any signs of water?" Without pausing, Sestra said, "Keep going." This was growing to be quite exhausting. Turael licked his lips, which were starting to become cracked. His mouth was just as dry. Just as Turael thought water was far out of reach, some trees came into sight. The chirping of crickets sounded ahead. The whole group began to gain more vigor as they speedily trudged into the forest ahead. The canopy of trees shielded them from the wind. The sun was crossing the horizon. They continued marching through the growing darkness when Turael began to hear a rushing sound from ahead. Water. They all broke out into a run. Splashing into a riverbank, everyone greedily began to drink from the stream. Turael didn't care about the gritty taste of the water. It was as cold as the brooks back in Woodsprig. Once canteens were filled, everyone began to break camp. Sestra and Calhoun set out their bedrolls some distance away from the rest. "Makes sense," said Henford to Turael. "They probably don't trust us completely. They did just free us from prison. For all they know, we could be murderers." Turael shrugged. He himself didn't feel completely comfortable around others. He was used to solitude and enjoyed being by himself. But that was different from how Sestra acted. She put off an air of confidence around everyone. Turael wondered how real that confidence was, if she was just trying to stay strong for her brother. "I understand that feeling," thought Turael. When times had been rough, Turael had feigned confidence for his own younger brother, Vanika. Turael eventually fell asleep, wondering how his family was faring. After some discussion the next day, it was decided that they would now travel southward, where stone mountains towered high in the air. Turael was fascinated with how strange this terrain was. Back in Havion, terrain changed smoothly. Deserts didn't just immediately become bluffs, and mountains near forests usually had sparse tree populations leading to them. The changes in terrain on this island were abrupt. The desert immediately became red clay. The clay abruptly met forest, and from the looks of it, the forest would stop just before Stone Mountains. The group slowly ascended a hill. Sestra was far in the lead, pushing foliage away with a spear that she carried. What if this place we're looking for doesn't even exist? Merls mused. Well, then we try to get back to the boat as fast as we can. I'd hate to be marooned and run out of food, Kincaid said. Turael smiled. He was confident that they could live off the land if they needed. It would still be frustrating to get stuck here, but they would manage. The discussion continued until Sestra called out, "Over here!" She was standing atop a hill close to the mountains. Everyone hurried to catch up. When Turael reached the top of the hill, he saw a magnificent, yet strange sight. To the left, he saw the towering stone mountains. To the right, he could see the red bluffs and mesas. Far off in the distance ahead, small dust clouds spun in the desert sand. And before his feet, the forest of trees continued. From the high vantage point, one important detail could be seen. Sand, stone, clay, and grass all converged to one point in the middle of the island. At that point was a large, gaping hole in the ground. "What is that?" Henford asked. "A cave," Sestra said, "where the four lands meet." Thanks for listening. What do you think awaits our adventurers in this cave? Why were they sent here? For what reason did the king imprison them? This story is based off of a tabletop game that I made for my friends. Leave a like and subscribe if you want to hear more of Radiance and Corruption. Until next time.